Goddag og velkommen hertil. Nu begynder vi, så hvis I vil høre om grænser for vækst, så træk nærmere.
We're going to start with talking about the limits to growth. And then we're going to end up we're going to talk about systems change, which is bigger than each of us. And then we're going to bring it all back to a very existential and personal level, into the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. So, cuddle together. And let's start with a couple of questions. Why, despite all our innovative capabilities, do problems like poverty and pollution and conflict keep plaguing humanity? And why, despite astonishing advances in resource efficiency and renewable energy, is our fossil fuel use at an all-time high, as is our ecological footprint? And why, despite being responsible for the vast majority of that footprint, has well-being in the rich countries been stagnating, if not decreasing? And the answer is quite simple. Solving poverty, caring for the environment, or fostering well-being is not this economy's goal. Its goal is growth. And sometimes growth contributes to well-being. But in other situations, when we already have enough to satisfy everybody's needs, it's better to share what we already have more equally. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. That I'm a sustainability researcher, and my research has led me to conclude that we will never achieve true sustainability without an economic transformation. So how my research started was with the limits to growth. I was doing my thesis at Harvard University, and I was very curious to see what had come of this study. So I did an empirical data analysis, and I'll tell you what I found. It's very interesting. This was, as you said, published in 1972, and it was a bestseller at the time. Most audiences when you ask, have you read it, they have never heard of it, because it was very effectively buried. But when I did a data comparison to their analysis, I found that it was actually very accurate. So what did they do? They built the first systems model of the world, meaning all kinds of variables can interact. I have another degree in econometrics. Those are very linear systems. In this model, environmental, social, technological variables interacted. And with it, they ran different scenarios. One was the business as usual scenario, which ran on historical averages only. Those are BAU, the blue line, the dark blue line, and BAU2. They're the same ones, except one assumes double the amount of resources, just to make sure, because we're not entirely sure what we have in total in the Earth. It doesn't matter, they both end in collapse, just to cause changes. And there is another one, stabilized world one, or sustainable world. And in that, we maintain well-being levels for the rest of the century. But in that scenario, there are assumptions of behavioral change in humanity, notably redirecting resources away from growth, from industrial output, towards education, health, and combating pollution. We are not most closely tracking to that one. But we're not so far away yet that we can realign with us. As you can see, the purple dashed line is empirical data. I think it's quite uncanny how close it is, decades into the future. So this would then suggest that we are at a now or never moment in history to determine well-being levels for the rest of this century. So this is why I've been led to conclude that if we redirect the resources away from industrial output towards health and human education, that means our economic goal has changed from growth to human and ecological well-being. It's a well-being economy. It is interesting to note that there's no scenario in which our well-being levels keep growing. Further growing is not an option. So when I talk about this now or never moment in time, there's no option to keep growing. The choice we have is whether the end of growth comes by design or disaster. Collapse does not mean the end of humanity, but it does mean a steep decline in beings, nonetheless. Either we choose our own limits, or we have limits to growth forced upon us. So now that we as humanity have reached global, unparalleled power, limits to growth forces upon us the question, who do we want to be? And what world do we want to live in? I'll tell you what comes to mind when I think about that question. And I think in one word, I could sum it up with enough. Enough as in no more. This is the limit, say a planetary boundary. But also enough as in sufficient, juxtaposing it to this constant grind of ever more, and instead invoking a notion of sharing, as in enough for each. And I believe the only realistic plan to avoid breakdown is this mindset shift from never enough to enough for each. What would it look like using more than one word? We have an idea because we already pretend we have a well-being economy. No organization's vision statement reads, a world in which growth perpetuates at all costs indefinitely. It talks about how they contribute to society because we all feel on some level that's what they should do. So in a well-being economy, business activities, government policies, and citizens' actions are all aimed at furthering human and ecological well-being. It doesn't mean we're anti-growth. We're just more selective about it. If it contributes to well-being, let's do it. If it doesn't, why must we? So this implies a different pathway towards a well-being economy for rich and poor countries. Because in poorer countries, below their share of Earth's carrying capacity and at low material footprints, growth more often still correlates with well-being. But in the rich countries, such as Denmark, it's much, what they have to do, the focus should be on reducing the environmental footprint back to sustainable levels while securing livelihoods by sharing more equally. Let me stress, because this is a common misconception. Decentering growth doesn't mean shrinking the economy until it crashes. It means reducing our environmental impact to within a safe operating space for life as we know it. That's not going back to a poorer past. That's changing the forward direction away from a cliff. Now, I know right now growth feels like an imperative, and it's understandable because our livelihoods have been tied to jobs. And so when I say let go of growth, they immediately think, how will I pay my rent? But we don't need growth to secure livelihoods. We can do that directly. We can have adequate pensions, universal basic dividends, the living wages. All those things are possible, and academics have been working on that. We'll still have jobs in a well-being economy and houses and fridges. We're not going to go back to living in caves. And businesses can still be profitable if they contribute to well-being, say in the renewable energy sector. But collective norms and economic dynamics will change. We'll redefine what has value and what work we call productive. With our livelihood secured, this trade-off between social and environmental benefits, which we often take for granted, it disappears. It inverts into mutual reinforcement. When our basic needs are securely met, we will not oppose environmental protections anymore, and better ecosystems, in turn, further human well-being. And we can expect much more such synergies. Fresh local food from regenerative agriculture restores the soil and improves health. Sharing more equally means less income and wealth inequality, improving social cohesion, and reducing wasteful, conspicuous consumption. Those things we buy only to display a certain status. Using efficiency improvements to reduce work hours instead of produce more. Will give us more time to sleep, exercise, connect with loved ones, which improves health and reduces all those things we buy to save time or combat feelings of loneliness. By not pursuing growth at all costs anymore, we can avoid a lot of those costs, like all the public expenditure on cleanups, healthcare, due to pollution. Now, admittedly, some things will not make sense anymore, like mega yachts, and I think we can live with that. Moving to a post-growth society is not choosing permanent recession. It's flexing our free will to change our notion of prosperity from ever more to better. How probable is this economic transformation? Oh, half the answer is that it is feasible. We know what contributes to well-being. We can identify human needs, so we can make policies for them, and they can be satisfied. So we don't need an endless supply of resources for that. And surveys indicate well-being policies are popular. Several countries are exchanging such policy practices in WeGo, the partnership of self-proclaimed well-being governments, like Finland, New Zealand, Iceland. Dozens of cities are piloting post-growth frameworks to operate within explicit social and environmental boundaries, like the donut cities. And the underlying values, like equality, sufficiency, care, also align with what most people say is important to them. Collapse in history is not unprecedented, but there have also been societies that avoided it by adopting new goals and values, for example, as described in Jared Diamond's Upheavals. And we demonstrated during the COVID pandemic that we're capable of making drastic changes for the greater good. Experiments with shorter work weeks for the same pay have had such positive results that many companies have now made it permanent. And around the world, communities are taking back the stewardship of their commons with co-ops in water, energy, and food. Now, that's not to say that we are on track for a well-being economy, but systems change is not a linear process. It happens when people, disjointly at first, start to build a different narrative. And over time, they form connections until a critical minority mass is reached, and that's a social tipping point. After that, the change becomes self-reinforcing, and only then does the majority come along. Typically lies around 25%. And therein lies the other half of the answer. Whether you believe we will reach this social tipping point ultimately depends on which of the three most common narratives you tell about who we are. So some say we are inherently selfish, violent beings. Kindness is a tactic to propagate genes and maximize self-interest. It's a thin veil covering the raging hunter, trying to outcompete while discounting impacts on others as externalities. We are doomed from birth to exploit our commons until nothing is left, let alone for future generations. In this story of separation, we are sociopaths, and a well-being economy is impossible. But social science shows that it doesn't actually describe us very well. The prevailing theory by now is that what has made us successful as a species was not so much our ability to outcompete, it was to cooperate. Much more than an appetite for violence, we have a proclivity for prosociality. We can be competitive and violent, especially when we perceive fragility around our basic needs, but we are wired for empathy. There's another common narrative in which humans are the apex species, with a birthright to take possession of the planet and shape her to our liking. Our innovative capabilities are limitless, and therefore endless growth is possible. And moreover, it is just because growth equals progress and brings ever-increasing well-being to all, eventually. In this domination story, we are masters, and a well-being economy is unnecessary. This narrative simply doesn't accord with empirical data. Despite aspirational talks of decoupling, the idea that the economy can grow without resource use and pollution growing along with it. There's no decoupling. Certainly not for a full impact on the planet. The total amount of raw materials we consume has been around 1.2 kilograms per dollar GDP for 2 decades. And things like biodiversity loss, water scarcity, plastic pollution is all worsening. But even just considering carbon emissions, which have reduced in intensity, sufficient absolute decoupling, which is what we would need, is nowhere in the data. Even the best performance in decoupling, like Sweden or the Netherlands, are nowhere near staying within the Paris Agreement. Not because we're not innovative, that part is true, but because in a growth-based economy, new technologies are used to create more of what we want instead of the reductions that we need. That's why renewable energy has been added on top of the fossil fuels instead of replacing it. So there is technological progress, but if deployment does not yield results anywhere near sufficient of what we need to avoid ecosystem breakdown, this techno-optimist argument basically comes down to it could be worse. And that's true. It could be worse. But also, it could be better. And that's really what I want to talk about. The promise of a well-being economy. Let's say we could replace the dying bee colonies with robot pollinators. Why choose that if we can also advance regenerative agriculture which doesn't cause insecticide? Why dedicate our innovative powers to tree planting drones if we can also use that thinking to redesign our economy so that existing forest isn't cut down? See, there's a third narrative, and this one has been the most prevalent in history and is still preserved to various extents in nations and exemplified, I would say, by indigenous communities. In it, we are part of a wildly complex web of life, of which we are eternal students, not to learn how to control it, but how to best serve her. Not only are we capable of caring for life, we derive a sense of meaning from it. In fact, we can't really be happy unless those around us thrive too. In this story of interdependence, we are nature. And a transition to a well-being economy is not just possible, it's where we long to be. The current system treats us as selfish, never satisfied consumers. It's hard to maintain a sense of community and purpose in this environment, or a sense of self-worth and belonging. In a world where you can never have enough, you feel like you never are enough. This economic transformation wouldn't be a capitulation to grim necessities. We'd want to do it even if we were not facing ecosystem breakdown. We'd have less stuff, but we'd have more of what we really need: connection. A well-being economy fits much better who we want to be and what world we want to live in. So, we started with these global problems and found that changing our economic system is imperative, but also feasible. And no sacrifice, but simply a letting go of what's no longer serving us, to find belonging in a post-growth world of embraced interdependence. If that sounds spiritual, that's what a well-being economy delivers: physical sufficiency, social abundance, and spiritual wealth, including the peace of mind that this prosperity can last. Thank you.
Okay, so let's say, let's say, okay, we here go out and get our friends to read your book and do the policies you suggest, vote for the right politicians. Everything aligns. We get everyone on board on this strategy, and we basically create a well-being economy. What's the most optimistic scenario in your view, given that we know that growth is ending in all the world free model runs? Either it's ending in 5 years, or it's in the latest it's ending in 2060. Given that we know it's ending, what's the best kind of response that we could hope for in a country like Denmark? So if we start with the light green one, then yeah.
Yeah, if you were to start now, and you wanted to align yourself more with the stabilized world one, I think you always have to start with securing livelihoods. Because people, a good example is the yellow vests in France. People want to combat climate change, but if people's livelihoods are affected through that, they will oppose it, and they were right to oppose it there, because Macron had just cut taxes for the wealthy, and then poor people can't afford gas anymore, and that's an unfair burden. So it absolutely has to be just. So you start with securing livelihoods, and there will definitely still be jobs around, but we don't have to get them through growth. You can secure that. So there's living wages, adequate pensions. The US actually, before they started to go down real hard with the capitalism and turbocharge that, earlier, around the 70s, or I think this particular one was in the 40s actually, guaranteed jobs. So if you couldn't find a job, the government would give you one. Which is great, because then the government could say, okay, we have this social need, like cleanup of rivers or something, and they would just do that. And it worked actually really well. And, for different reasons, and Reagan was a big one later, and all those things were abandoned. But it's interesting that the US, where I live now, used to do a lot of interesting pilots around all these things. Living, universal basic income, same thing. They did pilots, turned out to work very well, and then it was abandoned. But we know actually which policies can just secure our livelihood. And that is, of course, where you have to start, because, first of all, like I said, otherwise people will oppose environmental restrictions, but also politicians are, the reason that politicians need so much convincing is because they have a fear of social unrest. So the absence of growth on an individual level scares us because we are insecure in our livelihoods, but politicians are afraid of social unrest, and that's a legitimate fear too, but there are policies without growth that you can have for that.
So a follow-up to that, 3 weeks ago, Jason Hickel was in Copenhagen for the Wellbeing Economy conference, and he basically made the same point, but he also said, if we do these kinds of degrowth policies and we make a green job guarantee, we make capital guidance and so on, people would vote for this in the EU. And looking at the last election, I'm not quite sure I'm as convinced, but what's your take on, do you agree that if we look at on a European level, that actually our populations would support this kind of policy?
Yeah, I think they're widely popular. It does look like that. The reason that people vote more populist is not... It's mostly because they're angry. And I think ultimately that also comes from this growth pursuit, because it's often portrayed as contributing to well-being, but you don't really see that. And everybody knows that it's environmentally destructive. But what is sometimes less misunderstood is that it's also socially degenerative, and it's eating up our social cohesion. It's driving income and wealth inequality, and that wealth inequality is what's fueling this populism.
So, we just before we talked about that the different authors of The Limits to Growth had kind of different perspectives on the likelihood of these things happening. And Donella Meadows, who unfortunately died quite young, she was probably the most optimistic, and she really thought that we would get to this sustainable world if we did all we could. Whereas Dennis Meadows is probably the least optimistic, at least now. So if we say, maybe some of you are thinking like Dennis Meadows, they were saying this for 50 years, they didn't listen, so probably they're not going to do it this time either. So in the pessimistic scenario, given that we don't think it's likely that we will get everyone on board as quickly as possible to stabilize, what should we then focus on? If is anyone feeling like that? It's unlikely that we're going to do this. Yeah? Okay. Yeah. So then, seeing that, and maybe you have children like I have, maybe you have grandchildren. What's a response that, in that context, makes sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question at this point. When this came out, limits to growth, we were still at the global level below Earth's carrying capacity. So they really envisioned us smoothly approaching it and then making a stabilizing right somewhere under Earth's carrying capacity. And right now we are very clearly in overshoot. We have been since the 70s. That's the thing with overshoot, is it will come down one way or another. So that is obviously the other scenario. Either we bring our own footprint down, or it will be brought down for us. What does that mean? It just means a lot of suffering, human suffering, a lot of environmental destruction that never needed to happen. I think we have to be very honest about that. It will just be. I think we're either way. Our economy is going to change. This is something that when people tell me like this is a political infeasibility, and I'm like, yeah, okay, but I'll take political infeasibility over physical impossibility any day. Like, you're acting like business as usual is a viable path forward, and it isn't. So, I mean, okay. And I do think that at some point, when it becomes clear, we will make the shift. And I think it's just a matter of how much destruction do we need to get enough people convinced. What we have to do after a collapse is pretty much the same as we would have to do now if we just avoid massive losses.
All right. So why don't we just start now?
That would be my preference. Yeah.
You make it sound so simple. No.
It is simple. It's not easy. It's a lot of effort, but it is simple.
I think my key takeaway from this is that it becomes very difficult if we assume that we have to solve these problems within the present framework with the present kinds of businesses. And you mentioned several times in the past days that ownership is a really important thing to look at. So why is that? Why is ownership an important criteria to question?
Yeah, I do want to point out something, though. I know we've all grown up in this growth-based economy, but it is important for perspective to realize that for most of human history, the pursuit of growth was not a thing, and it was mostly seen as downright immoral. So it's not like we've never lived without it. In fact, quite the opposite. We have designed our systems now around it, and it is true that once you are in a system, it starts to feel like it's the only natural way things work, but this is not the case. This is like, we used to have aristocrats in Europe who had enormous wealth accumulated in just a bunch of people who said they were, I don't know, the God-given rights to hoard all that wealth. And everybody, most of the population just went with it. And then, because that was the narrative, and they really believed that was the case. And at some point, right now, if people started to act like a king, no. This is just to show how pervasive these narratives are in shaping our behavior. And I think it's important to have that perspective, at least. This is not, chasing growth at all costs is not natural. And our economy is not a beta science. It's a social science. The economy is a human concept, and we can change it.
How do we change the narrative?
How do we change the narrative?
How do we change the narrative? That's what I'm here for, to we have to do that together. Yeah. And like I said, there are these social tipping points, and that's why it's so important to start there, I think, because that's shaping what we think is possible. And that's precisely why I do talks like this, where and that's why I liked where afterwards you said talk to each other. This is how it happens when we start to make new stories, and then you go home and you talk to a family member, and you talk to a colleague, and that's how it happens. And you don't need to convince the majority. The social tipping point lies around 25%, and after that it becomes self-reinforcing, and only then the majority comes along. So talk to people and ask questions, especially to politicians. Some you will never convince, but some might be more open. And as soon as the so-called Overton window changes of what is politically possible, because there's more and more support, some might flip. So it doesn't. That's the thing with systems change. It's so overwhelming. It's so much bigger than yourself, and at the same time, it's so personal. It starts with the personal. These things that you've been told about yourself, about what you want. Like I said, this idea that you're selfish and you're a maximizer, etc. Question that, and then it cannot. Systems change cannot stay at the personal level, but it is where it starts, and then find your place in the system where you can make a difference. The thing with the system is you never have control, so that's very frustrating. But it also means because you're part of the system, there's always something that you can do, and so you have to find your part in that system to have influence.